Well, I mean, the kind of growth that people expect, I mean, people as in perhaps our planners expect today is it's increasingly, well, the sector that I look at, let me begin by saying that the sector that I look at is agriculture, and basically look at the ways in which knowledge and governance systems work in agriculture, formal science and technology, but also other forms of knowledge. Again, formalization is something that can be appropriated and used and sold. So it's not even a question of how equitable it would be. But what for me, therefore, the conceptualization of growth and the ways in which it would deal with the sector that I look at is perhaps a little disappointing. And I'm not really looking forward to more dialogue about agricultural growth. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, but India is a country that does not have a policy for agriculture. I mean, forget the fact that we don't have a standing committee on agricultural research like Europe does or anything of that sort. We have what's called a 4% growth rate as the target, the policy goal for agriculture. I mean, and that's actually a big tragedy. I mean, what kind of world are we living in if we say the target for the sector, the policy for the sector itself, I mean, that as decided by the bureaucracy, not again politically or socially debated kind of policy. It's just something that it's a bureaucratic wish list that's there on the website. In the 1970s, we had, well, a new strategy for agriculture and so on. Again, not a policy document, not politically debated, never submitted in parliament for debate, nothing. But what we have now is since the year 2000, which was again the first time at least a wish list by the bureaucracy was made available. But even there, it's just 4% growth. So what are we talking about? It's not really a target, because you can have 4% like you have 4% growth rate or 2% growth rate like you have now, where 60% of the growth rate is contributed by price increase, by value changes, the so-called false changes, not by changes in real production or productivity. Incremental response to unit input use has been falling steadily since the 1980s, since the 1970s. But we've just been living with it, increasing subsidies, feeling happy about it. So growth really doesn't mean very much to me, especially in agriculture. Oh yes, of course, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, and in fact, it's not just impacting agriculture in terms of fertilizers, as is most commonly assumed, and or is probably more relatively well accepted, that fertilizer prices will increase once oil prices increase. That's just one part of the story. Because as fertilizer prices increase, you would increase your subsidies to make the so-called fertilizers available more to farmers. Yeah, yes, the higher oil prices would definitely impact agriculture, and we've seen that. I mean, we've seen that in 2008, 2009. I mean, there were all kinds of crises with fuel prices shooting up. Food prices would increase, yes, but more importantly, fertilizer price increase is more, well, let's say, accepted. But even beyond that, I mean, the fact that when fertilizer prices increase because of oil price increases, there is a whole machinery that sets to work, and sets to work in literally perpetuating that one, well, let's say, oil-driven alternative, which is, if you look at the history of agriculture, just a blip. It's like, let's say, 11 hours, 55 minutes is when this oil comes into agriculture. I mean, we've had agriculture for a really long time, and since the 1950s, when agriculture, when actually 1940s, 1950s, when this whole chemical industry becomes important for agriculture, when this whole green revolution is launched, and this really oily grip strangling agriculture has become even more tenacious, and actually has generated its own mechanism of what is the so-called public sector, the so-called public policy. When I say public sector, and public sector fertilizer industry, those kinds of structures that are there for facilitating this whole state trading corporations. There's a whole mechanism that's designed to enable this. The fact that well, the so-called organizational and institutional convergence that is, let's say, literally driven by the oil mechanisms or the oil industry as the key input that drives agriculture, that is far more dangerous than oil itself, because that perpetuates itself, that kind of socially reproduces. Right now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but in this, once organic agriculture has become popular and so on, the whole industry is now, the fertilizer industry is demanding concessions or subsidies to produce oil industry, and that's been, to produce biofertilizers. That's being readily granted. because there is this mechanism out there, this whole policy making and incentive structures that are there that will grant them all this. Well, that's something that I haven't spoken about yet, but I mean, increase in food prices, yes, would be a danger not just to us as urban consumers, but to farmers in general, because I mean, as you know, 86% of India's holdings are small holdings, and though they are productive in the sense of systems productivity and I mean, even in terms of sustainability, far better than the large farms, they do not produce enough to feed a family throughout the year. I mean, they would definitely have to rely on a certain amount of cash purchase. Now, if you see that about 40% of their food comes from cash purchases and food prices increase, some of the essential nutrients like proteins, for instance, would have to be cash purchase things, and that's definitely not going to be sustainable given the kind of food price increases that you have. So in terms of small producers and their ability to agricultural labor, rural women in general, their ability to purchase food is definitely, indirectly proportional to the kind of fossil fuel price increases that we see now. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to say in as an answer to the earlier question. The fact that there is evidence, that there has been evidence, Howard 1920s, 1930s in India. And there have been plenty of people who've written about our own traditional farming systems. There's been plenty of evidence about generating and sustaining local food systems. I mean, what are the kind of mechanisms, structures that facilitate it? We have done which in some sense was a bit of a stroke of luck. That we were a group of like-minded people who were put together by the Planning Commission, by the previous Planning Commission, or perhaps last, given the government, on the working group on natural resource management and rainfed farming. Now there we kind of advocated a natural resource-based production system, which looks at agricultural, ecological, and social sustainability with completely decentralized. I mean, right now we don't go beyond the state level, even in terms of knowledge generation or access to knowledge questions and all your subsidies and stuff comes to the state and then to the district and gets transferred down to the blocks. Now, if we have a decentralized system of, like Ashish was saying today, a decentralized system of at the block level or the mandal level, like you have in Andhra, individually owned is what we have now, fine. I mean, at least start with that. Of systems of producing and generating local food systems, I mean, like supply systems, storage systems, processing systems, where you can actually do that. I mean, you can actually employ, the Hubli sandbox thing that we've heard about. These things are experiments that are working, and these are working in a really sustainable way. It's not for lack of evidence that the state is not doing anything. I mean, there have been recommendations made by various people. I mean, this working group thing is the one that I was involved in, and therefore I mentioned it. But that's just one among several pieces of evidence that's available to the state. It's mainly an unwillingness to listen and a faith in the so-called, fossil fuel-driven growth that keeps us going. I don't know, Ajay Dandekar, I think, mentioned this in the symposium about the Dunkel draft, and that was the first time I went out on a protest as a student, and we didn't even know what the Dunkel draft was then at that time. But then increasingly, when we look at food as a commodity that is traded as derivatives trading, and like this MCDEX and those kinds of mechanisms, I mean, it's scary because it alienates food completely from the ecosystem. It alienates food completely from the producers who are actually involved in and know what the food is like, and it alienates food from consumers. I mean, so what is food? I mean, if it doesn't belong to at least these 3-4 constituencies, then it's not really something that ought to nourish people. But I mean, the tragedy is that even now we have, from 1986 was a Ramlingasamy report which said that women in South Asia are undernourished, and therefore you address gender and the stickiness of the gender question, and therefore unless and until you address the stickiness of the gender question in South Asian development, you will not have well-nourished mothers and children. Now, that's been there with us since 1986. But nothing has changed, you know. We still, what do we do now when we have children dying of diarrhea? Because they are born to zinc deficient mothers, you know, anemic mothers who are also zinc deficient. Therefore, the children, when they have diarrhea, their body doesn't absorb the ORS that's given to them. The solution now is again technological. You know, they've added ICMR prescribes zinc addition to the ORS. Yeah, so we have solutions. So that's precisely what I was talking about in the as answer to the first question. There is such a big mechanism out there to support this, that they will churn out solutions. I mean, you may move from zinc addition in ORS to zinc and manganese addition. You know, you may feed prenatal, postnatal care or whatever for the mothers, but you will not address this disjuncture, this complete disjuncture between environment and agriculture and health, you know, or nutrition. I actually, when I was doing a small working paper for this eco-fair trade dialogue, people on peak oil, agriculture and trade, I did look at evidence from India, and there's some I mean, let's say a few studies on agriculture and energy use in agriculture, you know, but then they're all done by state agriculture universities, which are unfortunately trained in production economics, and therefore their energy use in agriculture is basically input use in production, you know. And that actually, even in the US, that accounts for just about 20 to 30% of the energy use in agriculture. You know, the whole other thing that accounts for 80% of the energy use in agriculture is there's a whole range of other industrial inputs that come into it, and industrial processing, transport, I mean, that whole paraphernalia. Yeah, now, which is, I mean, I should say, fortunately not there in India. So maybe studies haven't been done on those things yet. We need to do some, yes, and the studies that exist now in terms of agriculture and energy use are limited to, you know, input use and, you know, energy use in terms of labor and so on. I mean, there isn't very much in terms of, not the pimental kind of work, you know, it's that you see in the US. You know, you don't find that here. I mean, at least not the ones that I've seen. There are a few efforts at the NGO level, yes. I mean, at civil society organizations who've tried to document, I mean, energy use and so on. But I haven't seen, you know, at least not from the agricultural science circles that I've worked with. No, I don't think population increase is because we are growing too much industrialized food. The population rhetoric is being used by the agricultural, well, this juggernaut that we have now as chemical intensive agricultural production systems. Again, extracting resources like the places. So it's population. The relationship between population and food production increase is perhaps more to do with work and, let's say, the lack of work, or work that provides you very little value added at the local level. You know, so people who would normally prefer 2 children would have 6 children because they have to bring in some value to the household. Yeah, so that you need more working hands, and therefore you have more children. So population increase works with increased food production in a very perverse way. I mean, it's not because more food is being produced that people have more children or population increase is happening, though the population rhetoric is used by the food industry, or let's say the agricultural industry. I would like to say yes, it is a disease. I mean, yes, it is a disease. But then the point is that, you know, I mean, like most diseases, I mean, we can't just dismiss it, I mean, or let's say look for cures to the ailment without looking at the body. I mean, we have to look at what is the kind of body that affects it. You know, growth is a disease that affects both the body and the mind. I mean, it's something that you presented today morning about body and mind. But the point is that it's this whole structure, this whole set of rules, norms. I mean, Veblen writes about it in 1906, you know, about why isn't economics an evolutionary science? You know, the ways in which certain norms that are overarching norms. I mean, growth as an overarching norm, as an overarching, an objective, or, you know, a goal or whatever. Is perhaps a much more dangerous thing, and it's not a disease that affects mind and body alone. I mean, it's something that affects our entire system. It's something that, you know, it's not. How do I put it? It's not something that's used by the economist. I mean, like, like you would. Yes, it is. Yeah, as something that has infected the whole system, and has well, it's so it's in some sense like an illness that you don't see because you know you so take it for granted that you don't see that it is an affliction within the system. And that's I think the unfortunate part of growth. Yes, it is a, I mean, I don't know, would you call that a side effect, or it comes as a package? It's not, it's part of the package. It's part of, I mean, like I was giving you the simple example of, I mean, the government of India, I mean, in its own reports, has written about, you know, rapidly declining incremental response to unit input use, yeah? But you still keep doing that. So it's part of the package. It's accepted. It is something that the system is designed for. I mean, and that is actually far more dangerous. And so it's not a side effect. If there is a side effect, I'll bring a technological solution to it, and that's what you have now. So it's not a side effect would be something that let's say would be an unintended, or I mean it's something that does like an equifinality in the system. It's not that. It is part of the package. It is meant to be included in the package.